Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to really get into it today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into war in the 21st century, which I mean, it's
Mm.
always a relevant topic, right?
Right, yeah.
But we've got a new Global Peace Index report for 2024 from the Institute for Economics and Peace. And yeah, it's got a lot of thought-provoking stuff in there.
Yeah, it really does. It's fascinating how much the whole landscape of warfare has shifted,
Yeah.
even just in the past few years,
Yeah.
The definition of conflict is changing, like right in front of us. Technology, geopolitics, all these new kinds of fighting forces emerging. It's crazy.
And one thing that really stood out to me in this report was this idea of peace inequality.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like income inequality, but applied to peace, you know?
Sense.
The gap between the most and the least peaceful countries is actually growing,
Yeah.
which creates this world where some folks get to enjoy all the stability while others are constantly dealing with turmoil and, violence and stuff.
Totally. It's like a tale of two worlds, right? And what's crazy is that gap, that disparity, is only getting wider. One of the things the report points out, it's actually a pretty sobering statistic, the world is less peaceful now than it has been for much of the past 16 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, peace has actually been deteriorating for 5 years straight.
So it's getting worse. The trend is going the wrong direction.
Mm.
I mean, you would think that with all the advancements and things we've accomplished as, as humanity, it would be the other way around. What's driving this decline?
Well, one key factor is that conflicts are becoming more internationalized. Think of it like a ripple effect, right? What starts as a localized dispute, something small, can quickly draw in other countries.
Right.
And of course, they each have their own agendas and interests. The report found that a staggering 92 countries are actually currently entangled in conflicts beyond their borders. That's the highest number since 2008. It's a lot.
So it's not just contained to one little area anymore. It's spreading out. But why? Why are more countries getting dragged into all these conflicts?
It's more nuanced than just everyone meddling in each other's business, although
Right.
sometimes it feels like that. But it has a lot to do with the global power dynamics. The world is shifting from a unipolar system where the U.S., was the dominant power,
Right.
to a multipolar one. It's like a seesaw that's becoming more balanced. The U.S. is still a major player, of course,
Yeah.
but other countries like China, Russia, and some regional powers are gaining a lot of
Maybe
weight.
gaining influence.
Exactly. And that makes the global power dynamic a lot more unpredictable.
Yeah.
So you've got that competition,
Right.
coupled with the fact that traditional powers like the U.S. and the EU are already stretched thin from ongoing conflicts. It creates this really volatile environment where these disputes are more likely to just erupt and then escalate.
So with more players vying for that influence, things are just naturally going to get a little more heated.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. It's just how it works, unfortunately.
This all kind of leads us to something that I find both really interesting, but also a little bit unsettling.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
The rise of drones in warfare. It's like we're living in a sci-fi movie, but it's really happening.
Oh, absolutely. The use of drones has just exploded in recent years,
Yeah.
especially in what we call asymmetric conflicts.
Right, where one side is a lot more powerful than the other.
Exactly. And one of the statistics in the report that really jumped out at me is this. Drone attacks by non-state groups have increased by over 1,400% since 2018.
1,400%. That's insane. I guess it shouldn't be surprising, though. I mean, drones are relatively cheap,
Yeah.
easy to get,
Right.
and they're incredibly effective, especially for groups that don't have the resources of a traditional military, right?
They're a total game changer. They've empowered these smaller groups to be able to challenge much larger states,
Yeah.
which has created this whole new dimension in conflict dynamics. And if you want to see it in action, just look at the conflict in Ukraine. It's a prime example. Both sides are using drones extensively for reconnaissance, targeting, and even direct attacks.
So it's like a real-life video game.
In a way, yeah.
Oh,
But
wow.
we have to remember there are very real human consequences to this technological revolution in warfare. It's not a game.
Right. And speaking of real consequences, the report talks about the economic cost of all this violence.
Oh, yeah.
And the numbers are just staggering.
The global economic impact of violence in 2023 was $19.1 trillion.
Yeah.
That's equivalent to 13.5% of global economic activity, or think of it this way, about $2,380 for every single person on the planet.
Wow. That's crazy. And it's not just about the money, it's about all the lost opportunities.
Right.
The shattered lives, the ripple effects that can cripple economies,
Hmm.
and hinder development for generations. It's like we're pouring trillions of dollars into destruction instead of investing in things that could make the world a better place. Just imagine if all that money went toward healthcare or education or fighting climate change.
Exactly. It's all about trade-offs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the report shows that over 74% of that $19.1 trillion, that huge figure, comes from military spending and internal security expenditures. It's a pretty sobering reminder of how much we prioritize conflict over cooperation.
Yeah. And I guess it ties back into that peace and equality thing we were talking about earlier.
It does.
Like the countries that are already struggling with conflict, they're the ones being hit the hardest by these economic costs. So it's just widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots even more.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Conflict leads to poverty, and poverty can then fuel more conflict.
Right.
It's this complex web of challenges we need to address if we want a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Yeah. So it's clear the global picture is pretty complex, a lot of factors at play.
It is.
What about like the situation on the ground? The report talks about regional trends and peacefulness. I'm curious what they found.
So one of the interesting things is that peacefulness has actually deteriorated across all regions since 2008. Even Europe, which is often seen as this bastion of peace and stability, has seen a decline in its overall peacefulness score.
Oh, really? Even Europe?
Yeah, mainly because of rising militarization. It seems like no corner of the world is immune to the forces shaping conflict in the 21st century.
If even Europe is experiencing this decline, it really shows how global these challenges are. What's driving that trend in Europe specifically?
A big part of it is just the escalating tension and military buildup between Russia and NATO countries. The war in Ukraine has cast this long shadow over the region, leading to increased defense spending and a heightened sense of insecurity.
So the ripple effects of that conflict are reaching far beyond Ukraine's borders.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that these conflicts rarely stay contained. They have a way of impacting the wider geopolitical landscape. And speaking of ripple effects, what about the Middle East and North Africa? That region has unfortunately become synonymous with conflict and instability.
Yeah, I can't imagine the report paints a very optimistic picture there.
Unfortunately, no. The Middle East and North Africa remain the least peaceful regions globally. 4 of the 10 least peaceful countries are located there.
Oh, wow.
You've got the ongoing conflicts in Yemen, Sudan, and now the escalating tensions between Israel and Hamas. They're all major contributors to that instability.
Mm.
And these conflicts are often fueled by this really complex mix of factors, including religious and ethnic tensions, political rivalries, competition for resources, and foreign interference. It's a lot to untangle.
It's like a powder keg that keeps getting reignited.
Yeah,
And this recent surge in violence between Israel and Hamas just seems to have further destabilized the whole region.
it really has. The conflict in Gaza has already claimed countless lives, and hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. And beyond that immediate human toll, it's also making existing tensions in the region even worse, and it's potentially drawing in other actors with their own agendas. It's a very dangerous situation.
It's like even as we talk about all this new technology like drones and cyber warfare,
Right.
the old drivers of conflict haven't gone away.
You're absolutely right. While technology is reshaping the battlefield, the underlying causes of conflict often remain deeply rooted in history, in identity, and the pursuit of power. And if we want to find lasting solutions, we need to understand those underlying drivers. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2024-11-15, part 2 of 3. It's interesting, though, how even with all this turmoil going on, there are these little glimmers of hope, like these positive changes happening in some unexpected places.
Oh, really? Like where?
Well, for instance, the report highlights Myanmar.
Myanmar.
Yeah, despite the ongoing conflict and the political upheaval there after the military coup in 2021, they've actually seen an improvement in their peacefulness ranking.
Wow, that's surprising, to say the least. I mean, considering all the images and news we see coming out of Myanmar, what's driving that improvement?
It does seem a bit counterintuitive, right? But the report attributes it to a decrease in the homicide rate and just an improvement in how people perceive criminality, like they feel safer.
Mm-hmm.
So while they're still struggling with these major political challenges and violence, there's been a reduction in some specific types of violence,
Right.
which has actually led to a slightly more peaceful environment overall.
Oh, it's like a reminder that even in some really tough situations, there can still be progress.
Yeah.
It's good to remember those positive developments, even as we talk about all these huge challenges. Speaking of challenges, the report also looks at military capabilities, and some of the findings were pretty eye-opening, to say the least.
Yeah, one that really stood out to me was that global military capability has actually increased by 10% since 2014. You might think that with fewer personnel, there would be a decrease, but that's not what's happening.
That is interesting. It seems counterintuitive, so it's not just about like the number of soldiers anymore.
Exactly. The report talks about this global shift in military strategy and investment. We're moving away from those massive infantry-based armies of the past
You're right.
and toward this, well, more technologically advanced weaponry. Think drones, sophisticated missile systems, cyber warfare
It's
capabilities.
all about tech now.
It really is. Countries are pouring resources into these cutting-edge assets, and they pack a much bigger punch, even though they require fewer people to operate.
So it's less boots on the ground,
Right.
more high-tech stuff.
Exactly. It's kind of like a global arms race,
Hmm.
but instead of just stockpiling weapons, it's more about who has the most advanced technology.
Right. It's a tech race.
Yeah, and this has actually led to increased spending efficiency. Countries are getting more bang for their buck by investing in quality over quantity.
Makes sense. I mean, technology has always been about doing more with less. It's cool how the report connects all these trends in military spending to that bigger theme of global peacefulness. It's not just about like who has the biggest guns anymore. It's about how technology is changing the very nature of warfare
Yep.
and how that's impacting international relations.
Absolutely. And to really capture these changes, the report actually uses a new machine learning methodology to analyze military capability.
Machine learning,
Yeah, they're going beyond just counting tanks or fighter jets.
right?
They're factoring in how technologically sophisticated those assets are, their combat readiness, their overall effectiveness.
So it's a more nuanced way to assess military strength.
Exactly. It's not just about brute force anymore.
Right, like a cutting-edge stealth bomber is going to be a lot more powerful than an old fighter plane from the Cold War.
Exactly. And so, who's leading the pack in this tech-driven arms race? The report points to China. They've seen the biggest increase in military capability since 2014, and countries like France and Russia have actually experienced a bit of a contraction in their overall capability.
So China's investing heavily in modernizing their military, and they're doing it quickly. What does that mean for global security? I mean, you've got China's growing military assertiveness plus their economic power. That's got to be shifting the balance of power in a lot of different regions,
Hmm.
especially in the Asia Pacific. Could this lead to more conflict?
It's a development we need to keep an eye on, for sure. The report talks about this growing peace inequality we keep coming back to.
Right, that gap between the most and least peaceful countries.
Exactly, and it's widening. It kind of paints this picture of a world that's becoming increasingly polarized, whereas some regions are relatively peaceful, stable, while others are stuck in these conflicts that never seem to end.
Yeah, and those conflicts have a real human cost. The report says over 95 million people are now refugees or internally displaced because of conflict.
It's a staggering number, and those are real people, real lives that have been disrupted by violence and instability.
It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just statistics we're talking about.
Right.
These are actual people.
Exactly, and as these conflicts drag on and become more internationalized, that number is only going to grow.
Hmm.
We need to find better ways to address these conflicts and provide support to the people affected by them.
Absolutely. So the report doesn't just focus on these big global trends, right?
Hmm.
It also looks at specific regions. South America, for example, has seen the second largest decline in peacefulness this year.
Yeah.
And the report attributes that to rising crime and political instability, with Ecuador being hit especially hard.
Yeah, Ecuador is a good example of how quickly things can unravel when crime and violence spiral out of control. The report mentions a huge increase in drug-related violence, gang violence, which has led to a sharp rise in the homicide rate and a lot of fear among the population.
It's a reminder that while we often focus on those large-scale international conflicts, the violence and instability that happen at the national level, even the local level, can be just as devastating.
Totally. And these kinds of internal challenges often get less attention, even though they have a huge impact on people's lives and the overall peacefulness of a region.
Yeah, and the report backs that up with some pretty stark data. For example, did you know that deaths from internal conflict have actually increased globally by over 475% in the past 17 years?
It's a huge increase.
That's insane. It's a reminder that conflict and violence are happening all over the world, affecting so many people. And we may hear about those big headline-grabbing wars,
Hmm.
but there are so many smaller-scale conflicts going on all the time, and those often get very little attention or international support.
They do, and it's a problem. The report also paints a pretty bleak picture when it comes to external conflicts. Since 2008, Every region has seen their scores get worse on the external conflicts fought indicator.
Mhm.
Sub-Saharan Africa saw the biggest deterioration with a 134% increase, followed by South Asia at 115%, and the Middle East and North Africa at 105%. It's pretty clear that the involvement of outside actors in conflicts is a growing issue.
Yeah, and it's not getting any better. The report links this trend of increased external involvement to that shift towards a multipolar world we were talking about earlier.
It does.
As the US and the EU become less dominant, there's more space for other actors to get involved, whether it's regional powers or even non-state groups. They all want to exert their influence and pursue their own agendas in these conflict zones,
Right.
which makes those conflicts way harder to resolve, right? I mean, when you have a bunch of different players with competing interests, it's got to be tough to find common ground and negotiate peace.
It is. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube where someone keeps changing the colors while you're trying to match them up.
Exactly. And the report points out that the number of conflicts actually ending in clear victories or peace agreements, it's dropped significantly in recent decades.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because of these forever wars, where conflicts just keep going with no end in sight. And we talked about technology changing the nature of warfare, with this shift away from those large armies and towards more sophisticated weapons.
Right.
The report even says that between 2008 and 2024, 112 countries reduced the number of people in their armed forces. It really seems like technology is changing how wars are fought.
It is. As technology gets better, countries are realizing they can be more effective with smaller, more advanced forces. The report uses the U.S. as an example. They've kept a really high level of military capability, even though they've reduced the size of their armed forces.
Right, so it's not about manpower anymore.
It's not just about how many troops you have, it's about the quality of your equipment and how well you can use technology.
Yeah, like we were saying, it's a tech race.
Exactly, and to really assess that shift, the Institute for Economics and Peace has developed a new methodology for evaluating military capability. They're using machine learning to analyze not just how many weapons a country have, but also how advanced they are, how ready they are for combat.
That makes a lot of sense. A handful of really advanced fighter jets could be way more effective than a whole bunch of old ones.
Exactly. And who comes out on top in this new assessment? The report points to China again. They've seen the most significant increase in military capability since 2014. They've been investing a ton in modernizing their military, focusing on getting advanced weapons and developing new technologies like hypersonic missiles and artificial intelligence.
So while the U.S. still has a big military advantage, China's catching up quickly. And that shift in military power has some serious implications for global security and the potential for future conflicts.
It does.
On a slightly lighter note, the report mentions some interesting stuff about regional trends. For example, Greece has seen the biggest improvement in peacefulness in Europe. They moved up 17 places in the ranking.
That's a big jump.
What caused that?
The report says it's mostly because relations with Turkey have improved a lot. That's led to less tension and improvements in key indicators like political stability and relations with neighboring countries.
It's good to see diplomacy working.
It is.
But on the other side of things, the report also talks about the situation in the Middle East and North Africa.
Right.
That region is still the least peaceful in the world.
It is.
4 of the 10 least peaceful countries are there. The conflicts in Yemen and Sudan are still driving instability, and the recent war between Israel and Hamas has just added to the tension and violence.
The situation there is just incredibly complex and challenging.
Yeah.
It's this volatile mix of conflicts, deep-seated historical grievances, and this constant struggle for power and resources.
You've got so many factors at play.
You do. The report emphasizes that if you want to resolve these conflicts, you need a multifaceted approach. You can't just address the violence, you need to address the underlying political, economic, and social factors that are driving that instability.
Right. It's about getting to the root of the problem.
It is.
And speaking of economic factors, the report goes into the economic cost of violence. It estimates that the global economic impact of violence in 2023 was $19.1 trillion.
That's huge.
It's equivalent to 13.5% of the world's economic activity, or $2,380 for every person on the planet.
Wow.
It's a huge reminder of just how much violence costs societies, not just in terms of human suffering, but also in terms of economic loss.
Absolutely. And it's not just the immediate costs.
Right.
The report emphasizes that violence can have these long-term economic consequences. It can hold back development, discourage investment, and just perpetuate these cycles of poverty and instability.
That's like a domino effect.
It is. The report gives the example of Syria, where the Civil War has caused the economy to basically collapse. Their GDP has dropped by an estimated 85%.
That's devastating.
It really is. It shows how violence doesn't just destroy lives, it can destroy entire economies.
Yeah. And that brings us back to that concept of peace inequality we were talking about earlier.
It does.
The gap between the most and least peaceful countries, it's getting wider, and it's creating a world where some people get to enjoy peace and prosperity,
Right.
while others are stuck in these cycles of violence and instability. What are the implications of that? Could it lead to even more conflict?
It's definitely a trend with big implications for global security, development, and just human well-being.
Yeah.
As that gap widens, it can make existing tensions worse, it can fuel resentment and extremism, and it can make it even harder to address the root causes of conflict and instability.
So it's not just about peace in one place.
It's not. The report suggests that if we want to address peace inequality, we need a more equitable and just international order, a world where all countries have the chance to benefit from peace and development.
So it's about creating a more peaceful world for everyone.
Exactly. The report reminds us that peace isn't just about stopping violence. It's about building a world where everyone can live in dignity, security, and well-being. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive, episode 2024-11-15, part 3 of 3.
We've talked about how war is changing and what causes conflict, but what about how these conflicts actually end? That's where the report gets really interesting and kind of unsettling.
Yeah, it definitely raises some important questions. One of the key takeaways for me is that we're seeing fewer conflicts end in clear victories or formal peace agreements.
So less decisive outcomes? Does that mean more stalemates? Or are conflicts just ending in different ways now?
The report actually points to an increase in conflicts that are classified as low activity, but they don't have a formal resolution.
So it's like things have calmed down, but there's no real peace treaty.
Exactly. It's like a simmering pot, you know. It
Mhm.
could boil over at any time.
That doesn't sound very stable.
It's not. It creates a lot of uncertainty and tension, and the threat of violence is always there.
So it's like a breeding ground for future conflict.
Exactly.
The report talks about the reasons behind this shift away from decisive outcomes. One of the big ones is the rise of asymmetric warfare.
Right? Where you have smaller, less powerful groups using technology and unconventional tactics to challenge those bigger, more established states.
It's David versus Goliath, but with drones and cyber attacks.
Yeah, it's really leveled the playing field. Groups like terrorist organizations or rebel militias, they can use things like guerrilla warfare, cyber attacks, IEDs to really disrupt their opponents and cause a lot of damage, even if they can't win in a traditional military sense.
So it makes it a lot harder to achieve a clear victory.
It does. These groups are often decentralized, they're unpredictable, which makes them really hard to target and defeat with traditional military strategies.
So the conflict just drags on.
It can drag on for years, even decades, without either side getting a clear advantage. It's one of the reasons we're seeing more of those forever wars.
Right, these conflicts that seem to have no end in sight.
And even when one side does win militarily, it doesn't always mean peace. The report gives examples like Syria and Sri Lanka, where victories were achieved, but they used brutal tactics that caused a lot of suffering and actually created the conditions for more conflict in the future.
So it's not just about winning on the battlefield, it's about what happens after.
Exactly. You have to rebuild, heal, address the root causes of the conflict if you want lasting peace.
The report talks about positive peace as the key to a more peaceful world.
Right. It's about fostering the attitudes, the institutions, the structures that create and sustain peaceful societies.
So it's not just about stopping violence, it's about preventing it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. And positive peace isn't just some abstract idea, it's a framework for peace building. The report talks about 8 pillars that contribute to a peaceful society. Things like good governance, a strong economy, equitable distribution of resources, respect for rights, good relations with neighbors.
So it's a holistic approach.
It is. It recognizes that peace is more than just the absence of fighting. It's about creating a society that's just, equitable, and thriving.
And the report actually says that positive peace isn't just a good outcome, it's also a really strong predictor of future peace. They claim they can predict drops in peacefulness with up to 80% accuracy based on these positive peace indicators.
That's pretty impressive. It shows that if we want a more peaceful world, we need to focus on building those positive things in society.
This deep dive into the Global Peace Index has been really interesting, definitely some food for thought.
It has.
We've looked at how war is changing, what causes conflict, and the need for new ways to build peace.
The report shows just how challenging things are in the 21st century. You've got those forever wars, the growing gap between peaceful and non-peaceful countries. It's a lot.
Yeah, but the report also gives us some hope. It shows us the power of positive peace and the things we can do to create a better future. As we wrap up here, I'm feeling this sense of urgency, but also possibility. The trends we've talked about are concerning, but we have to understand them if we want to do something about them.
Absolutely.
We can't just sit back and watch. We all have a role to play in promoting peace. Maybe it's supporting peace-building organizations. Maybe it's speaking out for policies that promote justice and equality,
Right.
or even just fostering a sense of understanding and empathy in our own communities.
Those things all matter. The report leaves us with this really important question. What can you do to help create a more peaceful future?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Mm.
As we navigate all the complexities of the 21st century, what choices are we going to make? What actions are we going to take? How are we going to use our voices to make a difference?
It's up to each of us to decide.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Global Peace Index. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more peaceful world.